Imagine the morning fog over Moorhead, Kentucky on June 22nd, 1887. It doesn't carry the smell of wood smoke or damp earth. It carries the deafening roar of 100 rifles firing at once. This wasn't a simple duel. It was a full-scale battle, waged street by street, where neighbors hunted neighbors from behind windows and doorways. The history books call it the Rowan County War, often dismissing it as just another mountain feud. But was it? How does a quiet county seat turn into a slaughterhouse? And how does one man, a charismatic saloon owner, become its undisputed king, holding life and death in his hands? Today, we separate the smoke of legend from the fire of truth to understand how a political argument on a hot August day unleashed 3 years of terror. To understand the blood that was spilled, you first have to understand the land. This was Rowan County, Kentucky, in the years after the Civil War. A place carved out of the Appalachian Mountains, where steep hills and deep, shadowed hollows kept communities isolated, suspicious of outsiders, and fiercely self-reliant. Here, the law wasn't something that came from the state capital in Frankfurt. It was something made by the men who held the most land, commanded the most respect, or carried the fastest gun. The forests provided a living, the cornfields provided the bread, and the family name provided your identity. It was a world that ran on its own clock and lived by its own unwritten rules. At the heart of this world were two powerful currents, pulling the county in opposite directions. On one side, you had the Martins and their allies. These were the Democrats, the old guard. They were farmers and landowners, men whose families had worked this soil for generations. They saw Rowan County as their birthright, a legacy to be protected. Their leader, John Martin, was a respected figure, the patriarch of a clan that embodied the traditional values of the mountains. They were the establishment, the deep roots of the county. On the other side stood Craig Tolliver and his followers. They were the Republicans, the ambitious newcomers who saw the future not just in farming, but in business, commerce, and control of the growing town of Moorhead. Tolliver himself was a force of nature. He wasn't some backwoods brawler. He was a sharp, charismatic, and utterly ruthless man who ran the town's most prosperous saloons. He knew that real power didn't come from owning a few acres of land. It came from controlling the flow of money, whiskey, and votes. He was a political boss in the making, and his iron will was beginning to forge Moorhead into his personal kingdom. This wasn't a simple family feud, not in the way the legends tell it. The names Martin and Tolliver became flags, banners under which people gathered based on their politics, their debts, their family ties, or simple fear. If you were a Democrat who felt the old ways were best, you stood with the Martins. If you were a Republican who saw opportunity in the changing times, you threw your lot in with Tolliver. Choosing a side wasn't just a political preference, it was a declaration of loyalty that could determine whether your family ate well or starved, whether you found justice in a courtroom or at the end of a rope. Life in Rowan County went on, with harvests and church socials, births and funerals. But underneath the surface, a bitter tension was simmering. It was the friction between the old world and the new, between the farmer and the businessman, the Democrat and the Republican. Every election, every business deal, every drunken argument was another ounce of pressure building in a sealed container. They were living in a powder keg, and they all knew it. All they were waiting for was the spark that would blow their world to pieces. The spark finally landed on election day, in the thick, muggy air of August 1884. You can almost feel it. The town of Moorhead is buzzing, not with excitement, but with a raw, nervous energy. The air is heavy with the smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Men, their loyalties and their tempers stoked by liquor and politics, are gathered near the polling station, eyeing each other with suspicion. It was here that the first words were thrown like stones. The argument started between a Republican named Solomon Bradley and the Democratic patriarch John Martin. It was the same argument happening all over the county, a clash of the old world and the new. But then, a new player stepped into the circle, Floyd Tolliver, a relative of Craig's. The shouting quickly turned to shoving, and in the chaotic scuffle there was a flash of steel. In a single brutal motion, Floyd Tolliver's knife found its mark, and John Martin, the leader of the county's Democrats, fell bleeding into the dust. This was more than a murder. It was a public execution, a message sent in broad daylight. The Republicans had struck down the head of the Democratic snake. The Martin clan, stunned and enraged, demanded justice. They turned to the law, but in Rowan County, the law had a name, and that name was Craig Tolliver. He controlled the courts, he controlled the sheriff, he controlled the narrative. And so, it came as no surprise to anyone when a jury declared Floyd Tolliver had acted in self-defense and set him free. For the Martin clan, that verdict wasn't justice. It was a declaration of war. It was proof that the system was rotted through, and that the only law they could trust was the one they enforced themselves. They retreated into the hills, not in defeat, but to plan. A few cold months later, in December, Floyd Tolliver was walking down the main street of Moorhead, wrapped in the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was wrong. A sudden volley of rifle fire erupted from a darkened alleyway. Floyd fell dead onto the frozen ground, his body riddled with the Martins' answer to the court's verdict. The blood of John Martin had been answered with the blood of Floyd Tolliver. A personal score had been settled, but a terrible line had been crossed. There was no going back now. The first drops had been spilled, and they had opened a wound that would bleed for 3 long years, turning the hollows and streets of Rowan County into a hunting ground. The war had begun. For 2 years, the war had been a story of back-alley ambushes and simmering fear. On June 22nd, 1887, it exploded into the open. Before the sun had fully risen, nearly 100 men from the Martin faction descended on Moorhead. They moved not as a frantic mob, but as a determined army, entering the town from multiple directions with a single, unified purpose: to cut the head off the snake and end the reign of Craig Tolliver. The first shot wasn't a single crack, but a deafening, rolling thunderclap as dozens of rifles opened fire at once. For the townspeople huddled in their homes and cellars, the world dissolved into a terrifying storm of noise. They could hear the high-pitched whistle of bullets passing overhead, the splintering crash of lead tearing through wooden walls, and the sharp ring of ricochets off anything solid. The street outside was no longer a place for commerce or conversation. It had become a no-man's land. Through the shifting curtains of gunsmoke, a deadly ballet unfolded. Tolliver's men, barricaded inside saloons and hotels, turned second-story windows into sniper nests. The Martins and their allies returned fire from behind overturned carts and the corners of buildings, methodically advancing toward the center of town. Moorhead had become a brutal chessboard where every move was a gamble with death, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt black powder. This was a war of neighbors, and the cost was intimate. At some point during the hours of relentless battle, a sharp cry of grief cut through the roar of the guns from the Martin side. One of their own had fallen, John Martin's son. A leader in the fight had been forced to watch his own bloodline severed in the chaos, a father's worst nightmare realized in a hail of gunfire. The stakes, already impossibly high, had just become personal in the most painful way imaginable. And then, at the height of the battle, the central pillar of the conflict simply vanished. Craig Tolliver, the undisputed king of Moorhead, had been directing his defense from a fortified position, a commanding presence against the storm. One moment, his voice was the anchor for his men. The next, there was only silence from his post. There was no heroic last stand, no dramatic duel, just a sudden, shocking absence. A single, unseen shot, fired by a Martin sharpshooter or a treacherous ally no one would ever know for sure, had found its mark. As the news rippled through the ranks, the fighting faltered. The organized defense collapsed into confusion. The gunfire sputtered out, replaced by an eerie, ringing silence. When the smoke finally began to clear, it revealed a town that had been brutalized. The walls of buildings were scarred with hundreds of dark marks, silent witnesses to the fury that had just passed. The battle was over. The king was dead. When the last echo of gunfire faded, a stunned silence fell over Moorhead. It was the silence of a graveyard. Slowly, cautiously, doors creaked open. Townspeople emerged from their cellars and hiding places, not to a town celebrating a victory, but to a scene of utter devastation. The streets were littered with shattered glass, splintered wood, and the dark, still shapes of men who had been alive just hours before. The air, thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder, now carried the heavy weight of shock and grief. The war was over, but the town felt like it had died with it. For the Martin faction, their objective was complete. Craig Tolliver was dead. They hadn't stayed to claim Moorhead as a prize. That was never the point. Their army of 100 men melted back into the hills and hollows from which they came, leaving the chaos behind them. They had rid the county of the man they saw as a tyrant, but in doing so, they had declared war not just on a rival faction, but on the state of Kentucky itself. They were no longer just feuding mountaineers, they were now fugitives. The Tolliver faction, once the iron fist that ruled the county, was shattered. With their leader gone, they were a body without a head. Panic and fear replaced the arrogant confidence they once held. Some of his most loyal men lay dead in the streets, while others, wounded or terrified of what was to come, fled the county, knowing that either the Martins' revenge or the state's justice would soon be coming for them. The empire Craig Tolliver had built with bullets and fear had crumbled into dust in a single morning. This time, the news of the slaughter didn't just prompt a temporary response from the governor, it demanded a permanent solution. The state of Kentucky had had enough. Soldiers of the state militia were dispatched to Rowan County, but they didn't come as peacekeepers to separate two bickering families. They arrived as an occupying force, with orders to disarm the populace and impose state law by force. Martial law, ineffective not in name, descended on Moorhead. The era of clan rule was over, brought to an end by the cold steel of state-issued bayonets. With the militia securing the town, the gears of official justice began to grind. Warrants were issued for dozens of men from the Martin faction. Rewards were posted for their capture, turning neighbors against one another with the promise of gold. But the fear in Rowan County didn't disappear. It simply went quiet. People who had witnessed the battle locked their doors and their mouths, terrified of getting caught in the crossfire between the vengeful Martins and the newly empowered state authorities. The gun smoke had cleared, but a new suffocating fog of suspicion and fear had settled over the hills. The gavels that fell in the Rowan County courthouse weren't just calling a room to order. They were trying to hammer a new reality into place. The trials that followed the Moorhead massacre were meant to be a display of state power, a clear message that the days of clan law were over. The courtroom itself was a theater of tension. It was the same building whose walls were still pockmarked with bullet holes from the battle. Armed militia guards stood at every entrance, their presence a constant reminder that this was not business as usual. The benches were packed with onlookers, family of the accused, Tolliver sympathizers, and curious strangers, all watching to see if the law of Kentucky was stronger than the code of the mountains. In the defendant's box sat the men of the Martin faction. But they didn't look like defeated criminals. You have to understand, in their own eyes, and in the eyes of many in the county, they weren't murderers. They were liberators. They had faced a tyrant that the law itself had failed to control. So they sat there, not with remorse, but with a quiet, stubborn dignity. They had done what they felt they had to do, and they were prepared to face the consequences, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Their defiance was a silent challenge to the entire proceeding. The legal battle was as fierce as the gunfight that preceded it. Cunning lawyers for the defense didn't just argue points of law, They put Craig Tolliver's entire reign of terror on trial. They painted a picture of a county held hostage where the legal system was a corrupt tool in the hands of one man. They argued that the attack on Moorhead wasn't an act of aggression, but an act of desperation, a people rising up to reclaim their own government. It was a powerful narrative that resonated deeply with a jury of their peers, men who had lived through those same dark years. And then came the verdicts. One by one, the men who had marched on Moorhead and waged open war in its streets faced the judge. And one by one, the astonishing results came in. Some were convicted of lesser charges and given light sentences. Others were acquitted entirely. In the end, not a single man was executed for their role in the battle. The most prominent leaders of the Martin faction eventually received pardons from a sympathetic Democratic governor, effectively wiping their slates clean. The state had flexed its muscle, but the outcome felt less like a verdict and more like a negotiated truce. The old power structure was broken, and a new one, led by the Democrats, had taken its place. The men who had taken the law into their own hands had been vindicated, not by the mountains, but by the very system they had attacked. So, was this justice? The Tolliver faction was gone, their leader buried. The Martin faction, despite laying siege to a town, walked free. The law of men had been spoken in the courtroom, but the final judgment sounded an awful lot like the justice of the mountains. It left a profound and unsettling question hanging in the Appalachian air. Who really won the war? The war ended, but the peace was a fragile, bitter thing. The hatred stirred up by the feud didn't vanish with the last puff of gunsmoke. They seeped into the soil of Rowan County and poisoned the roots of the community for generations. For decades after the massacre, the names Martin and Tolliver were spoken with caution. They dictated who you did business with, whose children your children were allowed to marry, and which side of the aisle you stood on in local politics. The shooting had stopped, but the war lived on in quiet, resentful hearts. If you visit Moorhead today, you might think the past has been completely erased. It's a bustling university town now, full of students who know more about textbooks than blood feuds. But the ghosts are still there, if you know where to look for them. For many years, the old courthouse stood as the most stubborn witness. Visitors could run their hands over the dozens of pockmarks scarring its brick walls, each one a physical memory of that terrible morning in 1887. And up in the cemetery, you can still find the grave of Craig Tolliver, the fallen king, a simple stone marker for a man who once held the county in an iron fist. But the most powerful reminders aren't the ones you can touch. They're in the landscape itself. The main street of Moorhead is no longer a battlefield, but the ghosts of the men who fought and died there still linger in the local lore. The winding back roads and shadowed hollows leading out of town were once the sites of countless ambushes and secret meetings. They are quiet now, but it's a heavy kind of quiet, the kind that holds stories. Most people who walk those streets today have forgotten the names of Craig Tolliver and John Martin. The story of the Rowan County War has faded from living memory into the dry pages of history books. But the story hasn't truly vanished. It has simply become part of the place itself. It's a lesson embedded in the land, a reminder of how quickly order can break down and how thin the line is between neighbor and enemy. The people may forget the details, but the mountains always remember everything. So we return to the question that hung in the gunsmoke at the start of our story. How does a quiet county turn into a battlefield? The answer, buried for a century under the myth of a simple family squabble, is now clear. The Rowan County War was never just a feud. It was a political war, fought for the soul of a community. The names Martin and Tolliver were the banners, but the real conflict was over power, control, and whose vision of the future would prevail. Craig Tolliver became a king because he understood that in a place where the law was weak, the strongest will becomes the law. And the Martins went to war because they believed the only way to fight a broken system was to burn it to the ground. This story is more than a dark chapter in Kentucky's history. It is a brutal lesson in what happens when people lose faith in their institutions, when they believe the ballot box is broken and the judge's gavel is for sale. It shows that when official justice becomes a mockery, men will seek out their own, older and bloodier form of justice in the streets. This is a story not just of Appalachian violence, but of the indomitable and sometimes terrifying spirit of people who refuse to be ruled by a tyrant, even if it means becoming killers themselves. It is a grim reminder that the line between civilization and chaos is not a fortress wall, but a thin, fragile thread of trust. And when that thread is cut, the most ordinary of places can become a hell on earth. The men who fought and died in Moorhead have long since turned to dust, but the lesson they left behind, written in blood and gunpowder, must never be forgotten. Imagine 10,000 American coal miners, rifles in hand, marching to wage war in the mountains of West Virginia. They faced a private army armed with machine guns and even airplanes that dropped makeshift bombs from the sky. This wasn't a riot. This was the largest armed uprising in United States history since the Civil War. The question that hangs in the air, thick as coal dust, is why? What could push thousands of ordinary men to the absolute breaking point to aim their guns not at a foreign enemy, but at their own countrymen? The official story is one of labor unrest. But those who lived it knew the truth. It was a war for the very soul of a man. Before the valleys echoed with the rattle of machine guns, there was a different sound. It was the rhythm of a world carved into the ancient mountains of West Virginia, a world of sharp ridges and deep shadowed hollows where the mist clung to the creeks like a shroud. These mountains were a paradox. They were breathtakingly beautiful, a fortress of nature that had long sheltered a proud and independent people. But deep within their rock, they held a treasure that had become a curse: coal. And for the men who mined that coal, the mountains were no longer a sanctuary. They were a cage. A miner's day began and ended in darkness. He would rise before the sun, his wife packing his dinner bucket, and walk to the mine mouth, a black wound in the side of the mountain. He would spend 10, sometimes 12 hours on his hands and knees in a cramped seam of earth, the weight of the whole world pressing down on him. His work was a constant gamble with death from rockfalls, gas explosions, and the slow, suffocating disease of black lung. He did this not for wealth, but for survival, to feed the family waiting for him in a flimsy house he didn't own. That house, you see, belonged to the coal company. So did the church where he prayed, the school his children attended, and the doctor who treated his injuries. Most importantly, the company owned the store. A man wasn't paid in the currency of the United States. He was paid in scrip, a private money printed by his boss, worthless anywhere but the single company store. Prices there were set so high that by the end of the week, his entire wage was swallowed back into the operator's pocket. It was a system of modern-day serfdom, a cradle-to-grave bondage designed to keep a man in perpetual debt. And this kingdom, built on black rock and broken backs, was ruled by force. The coal operators employed private armies of guards, most notoriously the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. These weren't security men. They were gun thugs, mercenaries in fine suits who patrolled the coal camps with rifles cradled in their arms. They were there to enforce the company's law. Their job was to crush any whisper of dissent, to beat any man who spoke of organizing, and to evict his family from their home at a moment's notice, dumping their belongings in the muddy street. This was the calm before the storm, not a peaceful calm, but an oppressive one. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a people pushed to the very edge of their endurance. It was a silence filled with unspoken fears, quiet prayers, and a deep, simmering rage. But change was coming, carried on the wind like a distant rumble of thunder. It came in the form of a simple four-letter word, whispered in the dark of the mines and behind closed doors: union. And that one word was about to set these mountains on fire. To understand the fire in the miners' hearts, you have to dig deeper than a coal seam. You have to go back to the very bedrock of these mountains, to the men who first settled this land. They were Scots-Irish, German, and English pioneers, soldiers who had been paid for their service in the Revolutionary War with land grants. They weren't looking for riches, they were looking for freedom. They carved their homesteads out of the wilderness with an axe and a long rifle, wanting nothing more than a piece of ground to call their own, far from the reach of kings and landlords. Their deed was written in sweat and blood, and their law was self-reliance. But then, the outside world discovered the treasure hidden beneath their feet. The railroad snaked its way up the river valleys, and with it came a new kind of king, industrialists and financiers from New York and Philadelphia. They saw the mountains not as a home, but as a vault to be plundered. They came with smooth words and complex legal documents, buying up mineral rights for pennies on the dollar from folks who could barely read or write. It was the greatest swindle in Appalachian history. The descendants of the pioneers who owned the surface of the land suddenly found themselves trespassers on the wealth that lay beneath it. This land already bore the scars of old divisions. West Virginia itself was born from the Civil War, a state torn from a state because its people refused to follow the Confederacy. That conflict had pitted neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. It had burned into the mountain psyche a deep suspicion of outside authority and a hardened belief that some fights could only be settled at the end of a rifle barrel. A man's loyalty was to his kin and his hollow, not to some distant government or, God forbid, some company from out of state. And so, the stage was set for a new war, a clash not between North and South, but between two irreconcilable worlds. On one side was the mountaineer, a man whose name was his bond, whose pride was rooted in his independence. On the other was the coal operator, a man who saw land as a commodity and people as an expense on a ledger. This wasn't just a fight over wages, it was a fight over a way of life. It was a battle between the spirit of the pioneer and the ghost of the feudal lord, fought on the very land the pioneers had once bled for. In the claustrophobic world of a company town, there were no secrets, only whispers. The mine foreman was the company's eyes and ears, a man who had often worked his way up from the coal face and now stood between his old friends and his new masters. His reports could get a man fired, or worse, blacklisted, a word that struck terror in the hearts of miners. A man on the blacklist was a ghost. His name was circulated to every mine in the region, ensuring he and his family would starve before he ever found work again. Everyone knew a family that had been broken on the anvil of the blacklist. The air itself was thick with suspicion. The company-paid preacher delivered sermons on the sin of discontent, weaving the words of God into a defense of the operator's greed. At the company store, men would gather on the porch after their shifts, their faces still grey with coal dust, but their conversations were guarded. A friendly question from a stranger could be a trap. The Baldwin Felts guards, who seemed to be everywhere at once, would lean against the porch posts, their presence a silent threat, turning men's conversations to weather and trifles. Trust eroded faster than a slate roof in a hailstorm. Old wounds festered just beneath the surface. Men still spoke in hushed tones of the strike at Staniford a few years back, where armed guards had fired into a crowd of miners, killing 6. They remembered the Holly Grove strike, where families had been evicted in the dead of winter, their belongings piled up in the snow. These weren't just stories, they were warnings. They were the ghosts of past failures that haunted every secret union meeting, held deep in the woods by the light of a kerosene lamp. This constant pressure cooker of fear and resentment turned minor slights into major grievances. A dispute over the weight of a coal car, a foreman's insult, a family getting better housing because they were loyal to the company. These were the sparks in the powder room. Rumors spread like wildfire through the camps. The union organizers were branded as Reds and Bolsheviks, foreign agitators sent to destroy the American way of life. In turn, the miners whispered that certain foremen were pocketing money by cheating them at the scales, or that the Baldwin Felts men were responsible for the mysterious disappearance of a Union sympathizer. The community was no longer a community. It was a fractured landscape of loyalties and hatreds. Families were divided, old friendships soured. Every man had to choose a side, even if that choice was silence. But in the West Virginia coalfields, silence was a luxury no one could afford for long. The ground was saturated with gasoline, and everyone was just waiting for the match to fall. That year, the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. The summer was long and brutally hot, the air so thick with coal dust and humidity it felt like you were breathing wool. The creeks ran low and warm. Old-timers, sitting on their porches, noted that the birds had gone quiet in the woods, a silence that felt heavy and unnatural. On moonless nights, a panther would scream from the high ridges, a sound that folk tradition said was a sure omen of death. It was a cry that slid under a man's door and coiled in the pit of his stomach. A feeling was growing in the hollows, a sense that the fragile peace was rotting from within. Then, the human omen arrived. He wasn't a railroad man or a lawyer in a fancy suit. He was a union organizer, a man who came not with a bang, but like a shadow slipping between the company houses after dark. He didn't speak on street corners. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones around kitchen tables to men whose faces were grim in the lamplight. He spoke of dignity, of fairness, of a brotherhood of miners standing together. His words were more dangerous than dynamite because they planted a seed of hope in ground that had long been barren. His presence was an immediate challenge. The Baldwin Felts guards, who had always been a threat, now walked with their hands resting on their pistols, their eyes sweeping over the miners with open contempt. The unspoken tension in the camps became a living thing, a coiled snake ready to strike. A miner's wife didn't need to hear the panther's cry to know what was coming. She saw it in her husband's eyes when he came home from a secret meeting deep in the woods. The exhaustion was still there, etched into his face, but something else had replaced the old resignation. It was a hard, cold resolve, a look that told her he had crossed a line in his own heart. She watched him one evening, cleaning his old hunting rifle with a slow, deliberate care he hadn't shown in years. He wasn't getting ready for deer season. In that quiet, domestic moment, she felt a cold certainty settle over her. The world they knew, with all its hardship and its small, fierce joys, was already dead. All that was left was to wait for the sound of the first gunshot. The company's answer came not in words, but in the splintering of doors. The Stone Mountain Coal Company decided to make an example of the Mingo County strikers, and they brought in their favorite instrument of terror, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. A dozen agents, led by the infamous Albert Felts himself, stepped off the train in Matewan. They were professionals, dressed in sharp city suits that looked alien against the dusty backdrop of the town. Their mission was simple and brutal: throw the striking miners and their families out of their company-owned homes. All day, they moved through the camp, kicking in doors, hauling furniture into the street, and leaving women and children weeping in the rain beside their meager possessions. It was a cold, calculated act of humiliation designed to break the men's spirit. But the operators had made a fatal miscalculation. They hadn't accounted for Sid Hatfield. The sheriff of Matewan was not a company man. He was a local, born and raised in the Hollows, a man the miners saw as one of their own. When he heard what was happening, he walked down to the camp alone. He didn't shout or draw his gun. He simply stood before Albert Felts and his armed thugs and told them that what they were doing was illegal. He informed them that in his town, evictions required a court order, which they did not have. For the first time in their lives, the miners saw a lawman stand up not for the company, but for them. The agents, bristling with arrogance and used to having their way, were stunned. They finished their day's dirty work, but a shadow now hung over them. As they prepared to leave on the 5 o'clock train, They walked through the center of town, their path blocked by Sid Hatfield and the town's mayor, Cable Testament. The entire town seemed to be watching from windows and doorways, a silent, grim-faced jury. Feltz, enraged at being challenged by a hillbilly sheriff, made a fatal error. He produced a warrant for Sid Hatfield's arrest, a flimsy charge cooked up by the company. It was a blatant power play, an attempt to publicly humiliate and remove the one man who stood in their way. Sid Hatfield just looked at the warrant, then looked into Albert Feltz's eyes. He didn't see a lawman. He saw a hired gun trying to impose a foreign tyranny on his home. The mayor declared the warrant was fraudulent. The air grew thick and heavy. Decades of resentment. The memory of every beaten miner, every cheated paycheck, every starving child. It all came to a head in that single supercharged moment on a dusty street in Matewan. The time for talking was over. The insults had been traded, the lines had been drawn. This was the point of no return. It was no longer a dispute over wages or a conflict between a company and its workers. It had become a raw, personal battle between two kinds of law, the cold, corporate law of the gun thug and the fierce, protective law of the mountains. And in the mountains, when a man's honor and his home are threatened, there is only one way to settle the matter. Hands slowly, deliberately, moved towards pistols holstered under coats. The first drops of blood were about to be spilled. No one agrees on who fired first. Maybe it was a nervous agent, maybe a defiant miner hidden in a doorway. In the end, it doesn't matter. A single sharp crack of a pistol shattered the afternoon stillness, and in that instant, the street in Matewan, West Virginia, became a slaughterhouse. That first shot was not an answer, it was a question, and the answer was a deafening, rolling thunder of gunfire from all sides. It wasn't a duel, it was an ambush, a spontaneous volcanic eruption of hate. For the townsfolk peering through their windows, the scene dissolved into a nightmare of smoke and noise. They saw the flash of muzzles, the blur of men dropping behind barrels and ducking into doorways. They saw a man in a fine suit suddenly jerk backward, his hat flying from his head and tumbling into the dust. They saw another man simply crumple, his legs giving way beneath him as if his strings had been cut. The air filled with the screams of men and the hornet swarm of ricocheting bullets. Splinters flew from the doorframes of the hardware store and little puffs of brick dust appeared on the walls of the bank. The chaos lasted less than a minute, but it stretched into an eternity. It was a whirlwind of motion and death, a storm of lead that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air grew thick and heavy with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder, a fog that momentarily obscured the awful tableau on the ground. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The last shot echoed off the buildings and faded, leaving a silence that was more shocking than the noise it replaced. It was a dead, ringing silence, broken only by the low moan of a wounded man. Slowly, the gun smoke began to clear, revealing the terrible price of that single minute. 10 men lay dead or dying on the ground. Among them was the town's mayor, Cable Testament, cut down in the first volley. And scattered around him, like fallen chess pieces, were the bodies of 7 Baldwin Felts agents. The invincible gun thugs, the company's private army, had been utterly decimated. Albert Felts, the man who had come to break Matewan, lay dead. His brother Lee lay dead beside him. And from the center of that swirling smoke, one man emerged, seemingly untouched by the hailstorm of bullets. It was Sheriff Sid Hatfield. He stood steady, the pistol still warm in his hand, looking out at the carnage he had unleashed. In the eyes of the miners, he was no longer just a lawman. He was an avenger. He was the man who had faced down the devil and won. It's easy to paint the Baldwin Felts men as monsters, as pure evil stepping off a train. But to truly understand the terror they represented, you have to climb inside their heads for a moment. In his own mind, Albert Felts was not a villain. He was a surgeon, and the Union was a cancer growing in the body of American industry. He saw the miners not as men, but as a problem to be solved. They were ignorant, ungrateful children at best, or dangerous foreign Bolsheviks at worst, incapable of understanding what was good for them. He saw himself as the hand of order, a necessary force protecting property and progress from chaos. The violence he dealt was, in his twisted logic, a form of medicine, harsh but essential for the health of the system. The transformation from professional enforcer to killer happened in the space of a heartbeat on that Matawan street. When Sid Hatfield, a local sheriff with mud on his boots, stood up to him, it wasn't just a legal challenge, it was a profound insult to Phelps's entire world. His authority, his reputation, and the very foundation of the company's power were being defied by a man he considered his inferior. In that moment, Hatfield ceased to be a lawman in Phelps's eyes. He became a symbol of the rebellion, the head of the snake that had to be cut off. The decision to draw a gun wasn't born from a sudden rage, but from a cold, calculated belief that this was the only language these people understood. It was pest control. But the men who pulled the triggers were not the true architects of this tragedy. Miles away, in comfortable offices in Charleston and Philadelphia, the coal operators who had hired Phelps received the news by telegraph. For them, there was no remorse, no pang of conscience for the men who lay dead on both sides. There was only shock and a cold, burning fury. Their primary tool of intimidation, the weapon they had used for years to keep the miners in line, had been shattered. They hadn't just lost a dozen employees, they had lost control. The aftermath in their minds was not a feeling of guilt, but a simple, terrifying calculation. The miners had fought back, and they had won. This could not be allowed to stand. Their response wouldn't be to seek peace, it would be to unleash hell. The beast wasn't dead, it had just been wounded, and a wounded beast is the most dangerous kind of all. The silence that fell over Matawan was heavier than any tombstone. For a long moment, the only movement was the lazy curl of gun smoke in the still afternoon air, and the slow, dark spread of stains on the dusty street. Then, doors creaked open. Faces, pale with shock, peered out. The people of Matawan stepped cautiously from their homes and businesses, drawn to the carnage with a mixture of horror and a grim, unspoken awe. They saw their mayor lying dead, but they also saw the bodies of the Baldwin Phelps men, the hated agents who had been the face of their oppression for so long. And in that moment, fear was eclipsed by a fierce, dangerous pride. They had fought back. Sheriff Sid Hatfield didn't stand admiring his work. The adrenaline of the fight was replaced by the cold reality of his duty. He was still the law in Mingo County. He began giving orders, his voice steady, directing men to secure the weapons of the dead agents and to tend to the wounded. For the miners who had fired alongside him, the world had been turned upside down. They were no longer just striking workers. They were killers in the eyes of the state, but heroes in the eyes of their own people. They had crossed a river of blood, and they knew there was no going back. The story of the shootout didn't just spread, it exploded. The telegraph wires hummed with the news. In coal camps up and down the Tug Fork River, the tale was told and retold, growing with each telling. Sid Hatfield's name became a legend overnight, a whispered prayer of defiance. He was the lawman who couldn't be bought, the gunman who couldn't be beaten. He was their David who had slain Goliath. The massacre, intended to break the Union, had instead become its most powerful recruiting tool. Men who had been afraid to even speak the word Union now proudly pinned on the badge of the UMWA. But while the miners celebrated their champion, a different kind of storm was gathering in the state capital. The coal operators, enraged and humiliated, demanded vengeance. The governor declared Mingo County to be in a state of insurrection. State police were dispatched not to keep the peace, but to crush the rebellion. A grand jury, stacked with company loyalists, handed down indictments for murder, not just against Sid Hatfield, but against dozens of miners. The full weight of the law, which had always been a tool of the operators, was about to be brought down like a hammer. The hunt was on. The coal companies plastered the state with wanted posters, offering thousands of dollars for the capture of Sid Hatfield, dead or alive. The surviving Baldwin Felts agents, burning with a desire for revenge, poured back into the region, their badges now giving them the legal authority to kill. The fight was no longer confined to one bloody street in Matawan. It had spilled out into the surrounding hills and hollows. The war for Mingo County had begun. The gunsmoke from Matawan settled not just on the ground, but in the hearts of the people of Mingo County, leaving a residue of fear and suspicion that poisoned everything. The county, already scarred by the conflict, split wide open, the crack running through every church, every store, and every family. The lines were drawn not in the dirt, but in glances across a room. At the company store, loyal company men and strikebreakers shopped in the morning. While union families would wait for the afternoon, the two sides refusing to even breathe the same air. In the saloons, a man's choice of whiskey was less important than the side of the room he chose to drink it on. This was a war fought with whispers as much as with bullets. The company held the power of life and death over the towns. A word from the mine foreman could get a man a better house, an easier job above ground, or it could get him blacklisted forever. Men who had once been friends now looked at each other with distrust, wondering if their neighbor was an informant, trading secrets for a few extra dollars in scrip to feed his hungry children. The pressure was immense, a daily test of loyalty that frayed the very fabric of the community. A suffocating conspiracy of silence descended upon the hollows. When the state police and company lawyers came asking questions about the Matawan shootout, they were met with a wall of amnesia. Men who had watched the whole thing unfold from 20 feet away suddenly remembered they were in another room, or that the sun was in their eyes. This silence was born of both loyalty and terror. They were protecting Sid Hatfield, their hero, but they were also protecting themselves. They knew the Baldwin Felts agency was not gone, merely regrouping, and its agents were now hunting for witnesses as much as for killers. To speak to the law was to paint a target on your own door. Yet, in this darkness, there were small, defiant acts of courage that burned like candles in a storm. A farmer from up the creek, who was not a miner, would leave a sack of potatoes on the porch of a striking family in the dead of night and never speak of it. A doctor's wife would organize the church women to secretly collect clothes and food for the evicted families living in tent colonies. These were not grand gestures, but they were acts of rebellion that carried the risk of ruin, a quiet testament that the company could own the mines, but it couldn't own everyone's soul. And for every act of courage, there was an act of quiet desperation that looked like cowardice. A man with a sick wife and 6 children, who had been a staunch union supporter, took a job as a company guard. His old friends spat on the ground as he passed, calling him a traitor and a scab. They didn't see a villain, they saw a man broken by a terrible choice. Mingo County was no longer a community of neighbors. It was a hunting ground, where every man was both the hunter and the hunted, a place at war not just with the coal company, but with itself. The hunt for Sid Hatfield was not a posse of local men riding for justice. It was a corporate invasion force. The Baldwin Felts Agency, its ranks refilled with hardened men eager to avenge their fallen comrades, descended on Mingo County with the full authority of the state behind them. They were no longer just private guards, they were state-sanctioned manhunters. Backed by the governor, they set up machine gun nests on the hillsides overlooking the miners' tent colonies, their sole purpose to intimidate and terrorize. The coal operators' money flowed freely, paying for guns, ammunition, and a network of spies. A handsome reward was placed on Sid Hatfield's head, a sum that could turn a desperate, hungry man against his own neighbor. But Sid wasn't running. In an incredible act of defiance, he continued to walk the streets of Matawan, serving as its sheriff, a pistol on his hip and a calm certainty in his eyes. He was not a fugitive cowering in the woods. He was a king defending his territory, and the mountains and their people were his fortress. Union miners, many of them skilled hunters and Great War veterans, became his unofficial bodyguards. They set up a sophisticated intelligence network, a grapevine telegraph that passed messages from hollow to hollow faster than any telephone. The arrival of any stranger, the movement of any state police patrol was noted and relayed to Sid within minutes. The hunt became a brutal, low-grade guerrilla war fought in the tangled wilderness. Baldwin Felt's agents, used to city streets, found themselves clumsy and exposed in the dense Appalachian forest. They would march up a creek bed, only to have a single, unseen rifle crack from the ridgeline, sending them diving for cover. The mountains themselves became a weapon against them. The miners, who had known these woods since they were boys, moved like ghosts through the trees, striking and melting away, leaving the agents frustrated, paranoid, and increasingly vicious. The hunters had become the hunted. It became chillingly clear to the coal operators that they could not capture or kill Sid Hatfield in Mingo County. He was too well protected, too loved, and too at home in the terrain. As long as he was there, he was untouchable. They realized that if the mountain wouldn't come to them, they would have to lure him away from the mountain. They shifted their strategy from brute force to legal trickery, using the very system of law they so often ignored. The trap was set. Phony charges, unrelated to the Matewan shootout, were filed against Sid Hatfield and his friend and deputy, Ed Chambers, in Welch, the county seat of neighboring McDowell County. This was enemy territory, a county completely controlled by anti-union operators where the sheriff was a company man. Sid was summoned to stand trial. He was faced with a terrible choice: ignore the summons and become a true fugitive, confirming the operator's claims that he was an outlaw, or walk willingly into a den of wolves, trusting a justice system he knew was corrupt. Believing in his own innocence and perhaps in the power of his own legend, he chose to face the law. On August 1st, 1921, Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers, deliberately unarmed to show they came in peace, walked with their wives up the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse. They were not met by deputies with handcuffs. They were met by a group of Baldwin Felt's agents waiting for them at the top of the stairs. The hunt in the shadows was over. The ambush, in the full light of day, was about to begin. There was no trial for Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers. There was only a verdict, delivered by a volley of pistol fire on the courthouse steps. As their wives watched in horror, the Baldwin Felt's agents opened fire. The men never had a chance to speak, to plead, to even raise a hand in their own defense. They were shot down in cold blood, their bodies tumbling down the stone steps of the very building that was meant to represent justice. The assassins, their work done, didn't flee. They calmly turned and surrendered their weapons to the local sheriff, a company man, with the confident smirks of men who knew they were above the law. The trial that followed was not for the murder of Sid Hatfield, but a trial of the system itself. The assassins were charged, of course. A trial was a necessary piece of theatre. But the courtroom in Welch was not a house of justice. It was a stage set for a farce. The coal operators' money paid for a team of the state's most cunning lawyers. Witnesses for the prosecution were threatened, their families intimidated into silence. The defense's argument was a breathtaking piece of fiction, that the dozen armed agents had acted in self-defense against two unarmed men who were accompanied by their wives. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with menace. Armed company guards stood along the walls, their gazes fixed on the jury box. The jury, made up of men who either worked for the company or lived in fear of it, heard the testimony under a cloud of unspoken threat. The outcome was never in doubt. It was a foregone conclusion before the first witness was even called. The verdict came as no surprise to anyone in West Virginia. Every single one of the Baldwin Felt's agents was found not guilty. They walked out of the courtroom free men, their actions legally sanctioned, their message to the miners now crystal clear. There is no law but our law. There is no justice but our justice. The system hadn't just failed. It had actively looked the other way. It had placed its stamp of approval on a cold-blooded assassination. This was the verdict that broke the miners' faith in the law of men. If their hero could be gunned down on the courthouse steps with impunity, what hope was there for any of them? If the courts were just another tool of the operators, then what was left? The answer was simple and terrifying. All that was left was the justice of the mountains. All that was left was war. The assassins of Sid Hatfield did not go to prison. They walked out of the McDowell County Courthouse as free men, and legend says went to a local saloon to celebrate their victory. In the eyes of the law, they were exonerated. But in the eyes of the mountains, they were cursed. Their acquittal bought them their freedom, but it cost them their names. They became ghosts, bogeymen in the stories told to children in the coal camps, a living embodiment of a justice system so broken it could call an execution self-defense. They may have escaped a hangman's noose, but they would forever be hunted by the memory of the man they killed and the hatred of the people who loved him. For the widows of Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers, there was no life to rebuild. There was only a duty to bear witness. They returned to Mingo County not as grieving wives, but as living symbols of the ultimate betrayal. Their presence was a constant, silent accusation, a reminder that their husband's blood was still fresh on the courthouse steps. They had seen the law of men, and it was a lie. They had no home to return to, because the idea of a peaceful home had been murdered along with their husbands. The community did not try to move on. You don't move on from an amputation, you learn to live with the wound. The story of the assassination and the farcical trial wasn't buried under a blanket of silence. It became a gospel of rage. The news traveled by telegraph and by word of mouth, a hot cinder landing on the dry forest floor of the miners' patience. In coal camps along the Kanawha River, men heard the news, and a quiet, chilling transformation took place. The talk of strikes and negotiations stopped. The talk turned to rifles. This was the final, unforgivable insult. The system had not only allowed their hero to be murdered, it had applauded the murderers. The miners understood then that they were on their own. If the law would not protect them, they would have to become their own law. If the courts would not give them justice, they would have to take it themselves. There would be no atonement for the killers in this life. There would only be a reckoning. In the days following the verdict, men began to gather. They came out of the mines and down from the hollows, their faces set like stone. They were no longer just miners. They were an army, gathering to deliver a verdict of their own. For decades, the state of West Virginia tried to bury the story of the coal wars. It was treated as a shameful secret, an embarrassment to be scrubbed from the history books. But you can't kill a story like this. It seeps into the ground and comes back up in unexpected ways, a ghost that refuses to rest. The family names, Hatfield, Chaffin, Testament, still echo in those hollows, carrying the weight of that bloody history. But the proudest and most misunderstood legacy is a single word: redneck. Today, it's often used as an insult. But for the men who marched on Blair Mountain, it was a badge of honor, taken from the red bandanas they tied around their necks. It meant you were a Union man. It meant you stood up and fought. The physical traces of this war are still there if you know where to look. Go to Welch today, and you can stand on the very courthouse steps where Sid Hatfield was murdered. The stone is worn, but the memory is sharp and cold. In Matewan, the buildings that witnessed the shootout still line the street, silent witnesses to that minute of thunder. You can almost feel the ghosts. But the greatest monument, and the most haunted, is Blair Mountain itself. For years, historians and archaeologists have fought a new battle there, a battle to save the mountain from the very same force the miners fought, the coal companies, who want to destroy it with mountaintop removal mining. And in that fight, the mountain has begun to give up its secrets. Walking those ridges, they found the evidence the state tried to forget. Thousands of spent shell casings from rifles and machine guns, the faint outlines of trenches the miners dug, even the rusted shrapnel from the homemade bombs dropped from the sky. The men who fought there are long dead. Their voices have faded. The state tried to erase their memory from the history books and tell a simpler, cleaner story. But the mountains remember. They hold the rust and the lead deep in their soil. They keep the score. So we come back to the question that started it all, the question that hangs in the gunsmoke of history. Why did 10,000 American men take up arms against their own government? The answer is now clear. It was never just about a few more cents per ton of coal. It wasn't a riot over a paycheck. It was a war for a single simple idea that a man has a right to stand up straight and that his soul does not belong to the company that owns his house. They marched on Blair Mountain because every other avenue of justice had been slammed shut in their faces. The ballot box was stuffed. The courts were bought. The lawmen were assassins. When the system itself becomes the weapon of the oppressor, the last and most terrible resort is the rifle. This is a story of brutality, of corporate greed so profound it saw human beings as nothing more than an expendable resource. But to leave it there would be a disservice to the men who fought and died. This is also a story of incredible courage, of the unbreakable Appalachian spirit. It's a testament to the fact that you can push a man, you can cheat him, you can beat him, but there is a line that you cannot cross. The miners lost the Battle of Blair Mountain, but their fight lit a fire that could not be extinguished. The blood they spilled on that ridge watered the seeds of the New Deal, which finally guaranteed the rights they had been fighting for. The lesson that echoes down from these mountains is a chilling and timeless one. It's a warning about what happens when power becomes absolute and when people are left with no hope and no voice. It is the story of ordinary men who were pushed into an extraordinary war, fighting for the very soul of America in the hollows of West Virginia. Their story was almost forgotten, almost buried beneath the weight of shame and silence. But the mountains remembered. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. In the cold, coal-dusted hollows of 1930s West Virginia, a ghost walked the mountains. They called him Little Billy Rhodes. He was a thief who never took for himself, a phantom who left sacks of flour on the doorsteps of starving miners' shacks. Then, one day, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. No body, no trial, no final shootout. Just silence. The company bosses called him a dangerous criminal. The law called him a menace. But to the families trapped in the crushing grip of debt and desperation, he was something else entirely, a prayer answered in the dead of night. Was he a real man of flesh and blood? Or was he an idea, a spirit of defiance that lived in the hearts of a whole community? Today, we dig through a mountain of legend to find the truth, to understand how the quiet anger of 1,000 miners gave birth to the ballad of Little Billy Rhodes. To find the man, you have to dig past the myth, and the story they tell always begins in the same place. A grey, clapboard house in a nameless company town, indistinguishable from 100 others pressed into the folds of the West Virginia hills. It's a place where the air itself tastes of coal dust, and the only clock that matters is the steam whistle from the tipple. This wasn't a community, it was a holding pen, built for the sole purpose of extracting coal from the earth and loyalty from the men who mined it. They say Billy was born into a miner's family, like every other boy in the camp. His father was a man whose strength was legendary, able to load more tons in a shift than any two younger men, but who came home each night with a little more of the mountain ground into his lungs. His mother was a woman who could make a meal from next to nothing and find a way to patch a patch, her silence a testament to a resilience that ran deeper than any coal seam. In that small shack, he learned the unspoken code of the mountains. You protect your own, you owe no debt to an outsider who disrespects you, and you never, ever show weakness. The world outside that door, however, operated on a different code entirely. The turning point, the moment the boy became something more, came with the sound of a cough. It was his father's cough, a wet, ragged sound that signaled the end. Black lung. The company called it miner's asthma, and docked his pay for missed shifts. When he finally succumbed, the company sent no condolences. They sent a man with a ledger to calculate the family's outstanding debt at the company store. The man who had given his life to the mine was now just a negative number in a book. The true breaking point came a week later. Billy, still a boy, but now the man of the house, watched his mother stand before the company store manager, a man with a soft belly and clean fingernails. She was pleading for a bag of flour on credit just until her oldest son could start in the mines. The manager checked his ledger, shook his head, and turned her away empty-handed. In that moment, Billy saw it all with a terrifying clarity. The injustice wasn't a mistake in the system, it was the system. He saw his mother's shame, the manager's indifference, and the well-stocked shelves that might as well have been a world away. That night, something in him hardened, turning his grief into a cold, sharp-edged purpose. He didn't cry. He watched. He began to truly see the woods that surrounded the camp, not as a playground, but as a sanctuary, a place with its own laws that the company couldn't touch. He learned the paths the guards walked, the timing of the supply wagons, the way a loose floorboard in the company store sang a different tune than the others. The mountains were teaching him, forging him. He was creating his own code, born from the ashes of his father's life. It was a simple code, but absolute. You do not harm a working man. You do not touch a family's meager possessions. You do not spill blood if it can be avoided. But you take back what was stolen, you humble the proud, and you deliver justice where the law refuses to tread. The boy who watched his mother walk away with nothing was gone. In his place stood a shadow, waiting for the right moment to fall. Before the full weight of the law and the focused rage of the coal barons came crashing down, there was a period of strange, tense equilibrium. The name Little Billy Rhodes settled over the hollows, not like a storm cloud, but like the persistent mountain fog, a constant, unseen presence that changed the landscape. He wasn't a man you'd meet at the company store. He was the reason you could walk past that store with your head held a little higher, knowing its power wasn't absolute. In those days, his legend was written on the porches of the needy. A family whose father was too sick to work would wake to find a side of bacon and a sack of potatoes by the door, left sometime between the last patrol of the company guards and the first light of dawn. A widow, facing eviction, might find a handful of real US dollars tucked into the frame of her screen door, just enough to pacify the company man for another month. These weren't grand gestures, they were acts of targeted survival, a quiet redistribution of stolen wages. His relationship with the community was a sacred, unspoken pact. They were his eyes and ears. A child playing by the creek might see a new company guard and mention it to his father. That evening, the information would travel through the camp. A ripple of warning passed in hushed tones between miners at the coalface, between women hanging laundry on the line. In return, the community became a fortress of silence. When the sheriff and his deputies came asking questions, they were met with blank stares, slow shrugs, and the impenetrable wall of mountain folk protecting their own. Little Billy? Can't say I know the man. This was Billy in his prime, a master of his domain. He moved through the world of the company town like a ghost in his own house. He knew which guards drank on duty, which managers were careless with their keys, and which routes the payroll wagon took on the last Friday of the month. He wasn't just a thief, he was an intelligence operative in a war nobody had officially declared. He had turned the mountains that imprisoned his people into his greatest weapon, a labyrinth of shadow and stone where he was king. This fragile balance was the world he had built, a world he sought to protect. It was a place where fear was no longer the only currency, where a single defiant man could hold back the tide of corporate greed. He had given his people more than just food and money. He had given them hope, a dangerous and priceless commodity. And it was this very success, this growing legend, that would eventually become the greatest threat to his existence. But a man who lives by a code is also a predictable man. And little Billy's greatest strength, that unwavering, white-hot sense of justice, was also the one crack in his armor. He wasn't a cold strategist. He was a man fueled by a righteous fire. His heists on company property were calculated, almost impersonal acts of war. But when the cruelty of the system took on a human face, his response became deeply, dangerously personal. The story they tell is of a new mine foreman, a man named Blackwood, who came to the camp with a reputation for breaking unions and a temper as foul as mine drainage. Blackwood wasn't content to simply enforce the rules. He reveled in the humiliation of the miners. One afternoon, he publicly berated an elderly miner, a man who had worked the seams for 40 years, for being too slow, kicking the old man's lunch pail into the mud and mocking him in front of his crew. For Billy Rhodes, this was not a matter of scrip or payroll. This was an intolerable affront to the dignity of his people. The system wasn't just starving them, it was now spitting in their faces. That night, little Billy didn't go to the company store. He slipped past Blackwood's own yard dogs, through the window of his private residence, and into the room where the foreman slept. He stole nothing of value. Instead, he took Blackwood's prized double-barreled shotgun from its rack over the mantel, broke it clean over his knee, and laid the two splintered pieces on the pillow next to the sleeping man's head. To the miners who heard the story whispered the next day, it was a moment of pure triumph. But in truth, it was a grave error. It was the first time Billy had let his anger guide him instead of his reason. He had shown his hand. He had revealed that the way to get to the ghost wasn't to guard the safes, but to wound the community. He had proven that he could be baited, that his fury could be aimed. And in the cold, calculating eyes of the coal company, a man who can be angered is a man who can be trapped. The company, led by the foreman Blackwood, understood its enemy now. Humiliated by the broken shotgun, Blackwood realized that the way to kill a ghost is to attack what it loves. He stopped looking for a man in the shadows and started looking for a lever in the community, a way to force little Billy into the light. And he found that lever in a widow named Sarah, whose husband had been crushed in a rockfall the year before. Sarah and her young son were a symbol of the camp's suffering, and it was widely known that they were among the first to receive the Phantom's nocturnal gifts. The affront, when it came, was an act of calculated theater. On a cold, drizzly morning, Blackwood and two of his hired guards marched to Sarah's shack. In front of the assembled miners heading to the morning shift, he accused her of consorting with thieves and possessing stolen company property. He wasn't arresting her. He was doing something far more cruel. He was evicting her. The guards began throwing her meager possessions out into the muddy street: a cast-iron skillet, a threadbare quilt, a small stack of books. Her son, no older than 7, ran out to grab his only real toy, a small bird carved from a piece of scrap wood. One of the guards deliberately stepped on it, crushing it under his boot heel. The news of this public humiliation spread through the mine faster than a gas leak. For the miners, it was a profound act of terror, a message that even the most vulnerable were not safe. For little Billy, hearing the story passed in enraged whispers, it was something else entirely. It was a declaration of war aimed directly at his soul. The crushed wooden bird, the woman's silent tears, the foreman's smug satisfaction, these images burned away all his caution and calculation. This was no longer about scrip or safes. The unwritten rules of their conflict had been shattered. Blackwood had crossed a sacred line, targeting the innocent to draw him out. In that moment, Billy's mission changed. The cool-headed strategist vanished, replaced by a man consumed by a cold, singular rage. He saw the face of the system, and it was Blackwood's face. The foreman had taken a silent war and made it deafeningly personal. This was the point of no return. To let this stand would be to admit defeat, to tell the miners that their champion was powerless against true cruelty. It would poison the very hope he had cultivated. A response was no longer a choice. It was an obligation. The trap had been set, the bait had been taken, and little Billy Rhodes began walking a path from which there could be no turning back. The character of the Hollows changed. The whispers about little Billy, once filled with a kind of reverent excitement, were now laced with dread. The older miners, the ones with the deepest scars and longest memories, knew what this kind of escalation meant. They'd seen it before in strikes that ended in bloodshed. An attack on company property was one thing. A direct, personal war with a company man was an invitation for a massacre. They knew that when a hornet's nest is kicked, it isn't just the one who kicked it that gets stung. An old miner, a man who had worked alongside Billy's father, sought him out. He met him not in the camp, but in the deep woods, at a place marked by a lightning-scarred oak. He didn't plead. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had buried too many friends. "It's a trap, son," he said, his voice raspy from a lifetime of coal dust. "Blackwood is goading you. He wants you to come at him. He wants a reason to bring in the guns from Baldwin Felts and turn this camp into a war zone. You do this, and every family here will pay the price for your anger." Others sent messages through the silent network of the community. They urged patience. The unions were getting stronger, they argued. Roosevelt's government was starting to make noise. There were other ways to fight, slower ways that wouldn't get people killed. They were offering him a path of compromise, a chance to let his personal fury cool and melt back into the collective struggle. They were begging their ghost to remain a ghost, not to become a target. But Billy's ears were deaf to caution. From his perspective, their pleas for patience sounded like a quiet acceptance of defeat. How could he wait for a union organizer to arrive next month when a widow and her son were homeless now? His entire existence was built on the principle of immediate, tangible justice. To ignore Blackwood's cruelty would be to break his own code, to betray the very people he was trying to protect. He saw their warnings not as wisdom, but as the fear that had kept them all in chains. His response, passed back to the old miner, was chilling in its finality. He put a woman and her child in the mud. There's no waiting after that. The conversation was over. His actions grew bolder and more personal. He no longer cared about stealth. One night, the two guards Blackwood had used to evict Sarah woke up to find their shotguns missing and a dead blacksnake coiled on each of their doorsteps, a clear mountain threat. Then, he went for Blackwood himself. The foreman came out one morning to find a single pristine bullet sitting on his porch railing, a promise of what was to come. The ghost was no longer content to rob. He was now actively hunting. Each act was another step down a narrowing path, stripping away his anonymity and locking him into a collision course. He was ignoring every outstretched hand, every offered exit, his eyes fixed only on the man who had become the embodiment of all his hatred. The company brought in new guards, hard-faced men from out of state who didn't know the miners' names and didn't care to learn them. They patrolled the camp in pairs, shotguns held at the ready, turning the already tense atmosphere into a powder keg, waiting for a spark. The community that had been Billy's shield was now a prison for its own people, and he was the reason. The weight of that knowledge led him to the one place he could think clearly, a rocky outcrop high above the camp, a crow's nest where he could watch the lights of the shacks below without being seen. It was there she found him. Sarah. The old miner who had warned him must have told her where to look. She didn't approach with fear, but with a weary, heartbreaking resolve. She stood before him, a simple woman in a worn dress, and in the pale moonlight, he could see the profound exhaustion in her eyes. "You have to stop, Billy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This ain't justice. This is just more trouble." She told him how the other women now shied away from her, afraid to be seen as her friend. She told him how Blackwood's men followed her son home from his games by the creek. She explained that his gifts had become a curse, marking her family for persecution. "You wanted to give us hope," she pleaded, tears finally tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. "But all I feel is fear. Every night I pray you don't do anything else in my name. Please, just disappear again. Let us be." For the first time since his father died, The cold certainty in his heart wavered. He looked at her face, and for a moment he saw not a cause, but a person he was breaking in his attempt to save her. Her words were a lifeline, a final off-ramp from the path of violence he was on. He could listen. He could heed the warnings of his own people. He could melt back into the mountains, let the Union men fight the long, slow battle, and allow the wounds to heal. He could let the ghost of little Billy die, and let the man live. But then he looked past her, down at the company town, lit by the cold electric glare of the tipple, and he saw the bars of the cage. He saw Blackwood's house, warm and bright, while Sarah stood before him shivering. The image of the crushed wooden bird flashed in his mind. To stop now, to walk away, felt like a deeper betrayal than any violence he could commit. It would mean that a man like Blackwood could break a child's spirit and pay no price. It would mean the system always wins. He looked back at Sarah, and the conflict in his eyes hardened back into resolve. "If I stop now," he said, his voice low and final, "then he wins. Then they all win. This has to end with him." He had heard the plea of the widow and chosen the path of the bullet. The final crossroads had been passed. The night of the payroll was a night of ritual. The heavy rains came, turning the camp's dirt streets into a river of mud, a perfect curtain of noise and shadow. Inside the company office, a single lamp cast a greasy yellow circle of light. Within that circle sat Blackwood, alone, the stacks of scrip and the few precious stacks of real dollars laid out before him like a king surveying his hoard. He was a man at the peak of his power, secure in his fortress of glass and wood. He did not hear the creak of the floorboards on the porch over the drumming of the rain. When the office door opened, it didn't swing gently. It was kicked inward, the lock splintering with a sharp crack. Blackwood looked up, not in fear, but in pure, undiluted rage. Standing there, framed in the doorway with the storm at his back, was no longer a ghost. It was a man, soaked to the bone, his face pale and set like a death mask. For the first time, the two men were in the same room, the entire conflict of the hollows condensed into the 10 feet of space between them. Blackwood slowly pushed his chair back, a venomous smirk spreading across his face. "So the rat finally comes out of his hole," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Come to see what a real payroll looks like?" He gestured to the money on the desk, a clear and final act of mockery. Billy didn't look at the money. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, never left Blackwood's face. The world outside, the rain, the camp, the entire mountain, it all faded away. The universe had shrunk to the size of this one small, lamplit room. "This is for Sarah." Billy's voice was unnaturally calm, a quiet stone in the heart of the storm. "This is for the bird." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He started to rise, his hand moving toward a drawer in the desk. "That worthless woman, that brat, you threw your life away for—" He never finished the sentence. A flash of brilliant orange light filled the room, so bright and so brief it seemed to steal the very air. It was followed by a sound so immense, so absolute, it was more than a sound, it was a physical blow. The single window pane behind the desk shattered, and the lamp on the desk leapt into the air before crashing down, plunging the room into near darkness. The argument that had raged for a month was suddenly, permanently over. The heavy silence that rushed in to fill the void was broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the tin roof and the frantic metallic spin of a single silver dollar that had been knocked from a stack on the desk. It spun on the floorboards, a tiny, glittering whirlwind in the gloom, before it finally wobbled, fell, and was still. In that deafening quiet, Billy stood in the doorway, the cool rain on his back a stark contrast to the sudden, stifling heat in the room. He could smell the sharp, acrid scent of burnt powder hanging in the air. There was no feeling of victory, no satisfaction. There was only a cold, hollow emptiness. The ghost of little Billy was gone, and in his place stood a man who had just crossed a line from which no one ever returns. For a long moment, Billy did not move. The only sound was the rain, a constant, indifferent witness. The ringing in his ears slowly subsided, replaced by a silence that was heavier than any noise. The fire that had driven him for months, that white-hot core of righteous fury, was gone. In its place was a profound and chilling emptiness, as if the act itself had scoured him clean of all emotion. He looked at the dark shape slumped behind the desk and felt nothing. Not triumph, not remorse, just the dead weight of a line crossed. A distant shout cut through the sound of the storm, followed by the frantic barking of a dog. The world was waking up to the sound of the shot. The spell was broken. He looked at the desk, at the stacks of scrip and cash scattered by the force of the blast. This was the prize, the very currency of the company's power. It was his for the taking. But he didn't move toward it. He realized with a sudden, devastating clarity that it meant nothing to him. It had never been about the money. He turned his back on the office, on the wealth, on the body of his enemy, and stepped back out into the rain. He didn't run. He simply receded, melting back into the storm that had delivered him. He moved with an animal's instinct, his feet finding sure purchase on the muddy paths he knew better than the lines on his own hand. The cold rain was a baptism, washing the smell of cordite from his clothes, but it couldn't wash the feeling from his soul. The mountain, his lifelong sanctuary and accomplice, was now his place of exile. The hollows and ridges that had once been his kingdom were now the walls of his banishment. From a high, hidden place, the same rocky outcrop where Sarah had pleaded with him, he watched the camp below erupt. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies in the dark as men emerged from their shacks, their shouts muffled by the downpour. A crowd was gathering around the company office. He was watching the consequences of his choice unfold, watching his own legend transform from a whisper of hope into a stark and bloody fact. The law would come now, and the company's wrath would be absolute. He had won his personal battle, but in doing so, he had lost his place in the world. The man known as Billy Rhodes was gone. Only the ghost remained, and its work was done. The ghost was gone, but the storm he had called down had only just begun to break over the hollows. Within days, the camp was transformed into an occupied territory. The company brought in a dozen more guards, hard-faced professionals whose only job was to make the miners pay for the sin of defiance. They patrolled the muddy streets with a swaggering authority, their shotguns a constant, silent threat. The camp, once a place of quiet, simmering rebellion, was now gripped by a cold and open fear. The company's revenge was not swift and bloody, it was slow and suffocating. The logic was as simple as it was brutal. If a community could spawn a killer, then the entire community was sick and needed a harsh cure. Credit at the company store was cut off for everyone. The scrip-to-dollar exchange rate was slashed, rendering their meager pay almost worthless. Every privilege, every tiny bit of leeway was revoked. It was a campaign of collective punishment designed to grind the spirit of the miners into dust, to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The most profound wreckage was left at the feet of the very person Billy had sought to avenge. Sarah became a pariah. To the company, she was the witch who had conjured the devil. Her shack was watched constantly. To her neighbors, consumed by their own new hardships, she was a painful reminder of the trouble, the woman whose name was now tied to a killing. The whispers that had once been of support turned to whispers of blame. The other women would pull their children close when she passed, as if the tragedy were a contagion she carried. The gifts left on her porch had become a curse, just as she had feared. The sacred silence that had once been their shield now became a weapon turned inward. The unified front against the company cracked, splintering into factions of fear and resentment. Men who had once shared a nod of understanding now avoided each other's eyes. Was Billy a hero who went too far, or a fool who had brought this hell down upon them all? The question hung in the coal-dusted air, poisoning the relationships between families, turning a community of brothers into a collection of isolated, frightened individuals. In his quest for a pure, singular act of justice, little Billy had done the one thing his enemies never could. He had broken the spirit of the camp. He had cut the head off the snake, but in its place, 100 smaller serpents of fear, suspicion, and misery had grown. The single shot fired in the company office had not freed them. It had only tightened the chains, and now everyone was paying the price. The law that came to the Hollows was an alien thing. It arrived in polished cars that struggled on the muddy roads, carried by men in clean suits who looked at the mountains not with respect, but with a flat, assessing gaze. A company foreman was dead, and the world outside the camp demanded a resolution. But their target, the man whose name was now spoken only in fearful whispers, was gone. A ghost cannot be put in handcuffs. A legend cannot be put on trial. So the law, prodded by the immense pressure and deep pockets of the coal company, did what systems of power always do when they cannot find a culprit. They created one. Her name was Sarah. The charge was not murder, but a tangle of legal terms that meant little to the miners: conspiracy, aiding and abetting a known fugitive. The trial was moved from the local courthouse to the county seat, a stage deliberately set to intimidate the mountain folk. It was a performance for an audience of one, the Blackwood Coal and Coke Company, who needed to demonstrate that the old code of the Hollows was dead, and their law was now the only law. The trial itself was the very picture of the culture clash. On one side sat the company lawyers, their arguments sharp, precise and cold, twisting the miners' code of silence into a web of conspiracy. Every miner who took the stand and claimed "I don't know" was another thread in the noose they were weaving around Sarah. On the other side, Sarah sat, a bewildered figure of quiet dignity. Her defense was the simple, unadorned truth. She told them about her husband's death, about her son's hunger, about the food that appeared on her porch like a miracle. Her simple truth was like a wooden bucket against a steel dam. It held nothing back. To the miners who packed the courtroom, their faces scrubbed clean but their eyes weary, Sarah was not a criminal. She was a martyr. They watched in stony silence as the life they understood, a life of loyalty, of protecting your own, of accepting help without asking questions, was presented to the jury as a criminal enterprise. They saw the proceedings not as a search for justice, but as the final public humiliation of their community. Their silence was no longer about protecting Billy Rhodes. It was a wall of contempt for the world that was judging them. The verdict, when it came, was a formality: guilty. The judge, a man who would never understand the desperation of a company town, spoke of the sanctity of law and order as he sentenced her to 10 years in the state penitentiary. There were no gasps from the miners in the gallery. There was no outrage. There was only a deep, collective sigh, the sound of a people having their worst fears confirmed. They had seen the true face of the law, and it looked exactly like the face of the company boss. Was justice served? A court of law had delivered a verdict. A woman was sent to prison. A murder case was officially closed. But in the Hollows, they knew the truth. The law hadn't brought justice. It had simply been the final weapon used to crush a rebellion. It had punished the victim to send a message to the ghost, and in doing so, proved that the only real crime in the eyes of the company was to be poor, hungry, and defiant. And what of the other side of this bloody coin? What became of the company that Blackwood served, the machine that had ground so many lives into dust? You might think the death of a foreman would be a blow, a disruption to their operations. But for Blackwood Coal and Coke, it was a godsend. Blackwood was a blunt instrument, and he had served his purpose. He was more valuable to them as a corpse than he ever was as a living man. His death became their martyr story, the perfect justification they presented to the newspapers and politicians for the brutal crackdown that followed. They hadn't lost a man. They had gained a pretext. In the immediate aftermath, the company prospered. With the camp terrified into submission and the last spark of defiance seemingly extinguished with Sarah's conviction, the mine became a model of ruthless efficiency. The new foreman they brought in wasn't a hot-tempered bully like Blackwood. He was a quiet, cold man with spectacles and a ledger, an accountant of human misery who never raised his voice and never had to. Production quotas were met and exceeded. The company store, now without any competition from phantom benefactors, squeezed every last cent from the miners. On paper, in the Charleston and Philadelphia boardrooms, the company had never been stronger. They had won. But a story like this has a way of seeping out of a hollow, like a poisonous gas. Men who eventually left the camp carried the tale with them. Union organizers, hearing the whispers, took note. The tale of little Billy and the widow Sarah became a dark ballad sung in secret, a cautionary example of corporate cruelty at its most naked. The name Blackwood Coal and Coke became a stain, a name that would be invoked years later during the larger, bloodier mine wars that would eventually rock all of Appalachia. The company met no immediate justice. Their victory was real, and it was absolute. But in crushing that small camp, they had inadvertently created a legend that would fuel the very movement that would one day challenge their entire empire. They hadn't put out a fire. They had just buried the embers under a layer of dry tinder, waiting for a wind to blow. The years that followed were quiet ones, but it was the quiet of a graveyard, not of peace. Sarah's son grew up an orphan of the coal company's justice. He was taken in by a distant relative, but he was never truly one of them. He was a living ghost in the camp, a quiet, watchful boy whose eyes held the memory of a trauma the town was desperate to forget. The name he carried was as heavy as a seam of slate, a constant, unspoken reminder of the day the ghost walked among them and brought ruin. He learned early to be silent, to expect nothing, and to work. When he was old enough, he went into the same mine that had claimed his father, a final grim surrender to the system. The community did not rebuild, it scarred over. The names Billy and Sarah were buried under a thick blanket of unspoken agreement. To speak them was to invite bad luck, to pick at a wound that refused to heal. The spirit of open defiance that little Billy had briefly ignited was replaced by a weary, pragmatic obedience. Men loaded their coal, women stretched their scrip, and they kept their heads down. The power of the company was no longer a thing to be challenged. It was a feature of the landscape, as immovable and dangerous as the mountain itself. They had learned the price of a hero, and it was too high. But the story did not die. It seeped out of the hollow and was carried by the men who eventually left for other camps, for other mines. And there, it found fertile ground in the growing union movement. The tale of the widow, the foreman, and the ghost became a recruiting sergeant's sharpest tool. It was told in hushed tones in union halls and secret meetings, a perfect, brutal parable of why they had to fight back not as individuals, but as one. The blood spilled in that small camp watered the roots of a more organized and far more formidable resistance. Nearly a decade later, a stooped, gray-haired woman stepped off a bus at the edge of the camp. Sarah had come home, but the place she returned to was a stranger's land. Her son was a man now, with coal dust etched into the lines on his face and a silence that mirrored her own. Their reunion was not one of joyful tears, but of a quiet, shared ache for a lifetime of lost years. She lived out her days in the small shack he provided for her, a ghost returned to a place haunted by the memory of what had been lost and what could never be regained. If you drive deep enough into those West Virginia hills today, and you know which forgotten state route to turn off of, you might find the place where the camp once stood. There's nothing there now but ghosts. Kudzu vines choke the life out of old stone foundations, and the rusted skeleton of a coal tipple stands against the sky like the ribs of some long-dead beast. The entrance to the mine is sealed with a slab of concrete, a final grey tombstone for the mountain's heart. The silence is absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling overhead. The company is gone, the houses are gone, the people are gone. But the story remains. It lives on, not in history books, but in the way a story was always meant to live in these mountains, as a ballad. They call it the Ballad of Billy Rhodes, and old men with calloused fingers still pick out the tune on worn-out guitars. The words have changed over the generations, but the core of it is always the same. A story of a stolen bird, a widow's tears, and a single shot that echoed in the rain. It's a ghost story told to children, a cautionary tale about the high cost of anger and the sharp edges of justice. The real monuments to this story aren't the crumbling foundations, but the two simple headstones in a nearby churchyard. One for Sarah and one for her son, who died an old man after a life spent in the mines, his silence as deep as the coal seams he worked. They are the tangible proof of the tragedy. But there is no stone for little Billy. His absence is his true memorial. By never being found, he was never reduced to a simple man of flesh and bone. He remains an idea, a spirit, and his name is still a kind of currency. In parts of those hills, when a new company comes in promising jobs but delivering poison in the water, when the deck feels impossibly stacked against the working man, you can sometimes hear his name invoked in a low murmur. This is the kind of thing that makes a man turn into Little Billy. He is no longer a historical figure. He is a symbol of that final, desperate line between endurance and rebellion. The man is long gone, dust in an unmarked mountain grave, or perhaps an old man who died peacefully under a different name 1,000 miles away. But his spirit? It never left the hollow. They say that on nights when the fog hangs thick and low in the valleys, so thick you can't see your own hand in front of your face, you can almost feel him watching from the tree line. He is the whisper on the wind, the shadow that flits at the edge of your vision, the ghost of a name that reminds the world that even in the quietest, most forgotten places, there is a limit to what a man will endure. So we come to the end of the trail, back where we started, with the same question hanging in the air. Was little Billy Rhodes a hero or a villain? The truth, like a mountain stream, is never that clear. He wasn't a hero. A hero saves his people. Billy's righteous fury brought a world of pain down on the very community he bled for, proving that a single act of vengeance can be more destructive than years of quiet suffering. His victory was their catastrophe. But he was no villain. Villains are driven by greed or a lust for power. Billy was driven by a love so fierce it became a fire, and a sense of justice so pure it was blind to the consequences. He was a symptom of a disease, a violent reaction to an unbearable pressure. He was a man who became a monster to fight a monster, and in the end, he was consumed by the battle. In the end, this is a story about the terrible price of a justice that is demanded in a single moment with a single bullet. It's a lesson that individual righteousness, no matter how pure, is a poor weapon against a cold and faceless system. A man's rage can topple a foreman, but it cannot topple a company. All it can do is leave a scar on the land and a ghost in the memory of the people he tried to save. And that, my friends, is the ballad of Little Billy Rhodes, a man who loved justice more than anything, but forgot to ask the people he was saving what that justice would cost them. They say the law came to Perry County, Kentucky, on the back of a horse. But on a cold day in May of 1889, it died on the courthouse steps with a single rifle shot that echoed like a crack of doom. The man who fell was Judge Josiah Combs, a respected elder who believed the law was greater than any family's grudge. He was wrong. That single shot wasn't just a murder, it was the bloody climax of a war. How did a place like this descend into such savagery? What drove men to assassinate the very symbol of justice? Today, we trace the river of bad blood back to its source, to tell the ballad of the Perry County War. To understand the blood that was shed, you first have to understand the ground it soaked into. In the 1880s, Perry County wasn't just a place on a map. It was a world unto itself, walled in by the ancient, unblinking mountains of eastern Kentucky. The Kentucky River was its one slow artery to the outside, and news traveled up it on flatboats at a crawl. Life here was hard, carved out of the steep hillsides with an axe and a plow. A man's wealth was measured in the corn he grew, the hogs he raised, and the children who bore his name. In this isolation, a different kind of law took root. It wasn't written in any book, but every man, woman, and child knew it by heart. It was the mountain code. Family was everything. Your kin were your nation, your army, and your only true shield against a harsh world. An insult to your third cousin was an insult to you, and it had to be answered. A man's honor was his most sacred possession. It was a fragile thing, easily bruised by a stray word or a sideways glance, and once broken, it could only be mended with blood. The state government in Frankfurt was a distant rumor, and its laws were seen as suggestions at best, an unwelcome intrusion at worst. Justice was a personal matter, dispensed from the barrel of a Winchester rifle. Into this closed world, whispers of change began to drift. Men with strange accents and fancy surveying tools started appearing in the hollows. They were agents of the great northern corporations, geologists and timber scouts who saw something the local folk had taken for granted. They didn't see steep hillsides. They saw mountains of virgin hardwood. They didn't see rocky soil. They saw the richest seams of bituminous coal on God's green earth. The railroad, they promised, was coming. And with it would come a flood of money that would make the old ways of life seem like a dream. Suddenly, the prize wasn't just survival, it was a fortune. And the key to that fortune was locked inside a single building, the Hazard Courthouse. The men who held the offices of sheriff, county clerk, and judge didn't just keep records, they controlled the future. They oversaw the land deeds, they set the tax rates, and they enforced, or chose not to enforce, the law. Whichever clan controlled that courthouse would control who got rich and who got left behind when the coal boom hit. This was the Forge. It took the old mountain code of honor and family loyalty and superheated it with the coming fire of industrial greed. Every election became a battle, every political dispute a potential vendetta. The stage was being set for a war, fought not by soldiers in uniform, but by neighbors and cousins. They weren't just fighting for power anymore. They were fighting for the soul of the mountains, and they were willing to turn their home into a killing ground to win it. Before the shooting started, you could still see the men for who they were, not just the leaders of warring armies. Take Joe Eversole. He wasn't some wild-eyed mountain brawler. He was a man who fought with words, a lawyer who could tie a man in knots with a well-phrased argument in the Hazard Courthouse. He'd sit with his family on his porch, not cleaning a rifle, but reading a newspaper from Lexington or Frankfurt, talking about the future. He spoke of railroads cutting through the mountains like steel rivers, of coal mines bringing payrolls and prosperity to families who had only ever known back-breaking farm work. His children would listen, and his wife would watch him, and they saw a man building a kingdom not of fear, but of progress. He was a Republican in a staunchly Democratic county, a man who saw the outside world not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He saw the coming corporations as partners, and he intended to be the man who brokered the deal, ensuring his family and his followers would be the first in line to reap the rewards. To his clan, Joe Eversole wasn't a warmonger. He was a visionary, the only man smart enough to guide them into the coming century. Then there was Benjamin Big Ben French. If Joe Eversole was the future, Big Ben was the living, breathing embodiment of the past. He was the sheriff, but his real power came from the sheer force of his presence. He was a massive man, built like one of the oak trees on his land, and his authority was absolute. He didn't need a law book. His word was law. On a Saturday afternoon, you'd find him on the steps of his store, a benevolent titan settling a land dispute between two farmers with a quiet word and a look that promised there would be no more argument. He was the patriarch of his clan in every sense of the word. He was surrounded by a web of kin who looked to him not just for leadership, but for protection. He was suspicious of the foreign money and the smooth-talking lawyers like Eversole. To Big Ben and his people, the coal under the ground wasn't a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder from Philadelphia. It was their birthright, part of the land their grandfathers had fought and bled for. Protecting that land and the old way of life it supported was his sacred duty. He was the wall that stood between his people and a changing world they did not trust. A man's greatest strength is often just the other side of the coin from his deadliest weakness. For Joe Eversole, his sharp, educated mind was his greatest asset, but it was also his blind spot. He saw the world as a chessboard, a place of logic and calculated risks. He believed the old mountain ways, the fierce pride, the stubborn loyalty to the past were simply obstacles to be outmaneuvered. He couldn't understand that in Perry County, honor wasn't a piece on a board. It was the board itself. He once publicly debated an old farmer loyal to the French clan, systematically tearing apart the man's fears about the railroad with facts and figures, and ending by calling his concerns ignorant sentiment. Joe won the argument, but he lost the room. He had shown contempt for their code, and in the mountains, contempt is a sin that demands a heavy price. Big Ben French, on the other hand, was ruled by a pride as massive as his own frame. It was the source of his power, the reason men would follow him into a fight without a second thought. But it was a rigid, unbending thing. For him, there was no such thing as a strategic retreat or a minor compromise. Every challenge, no matter how small, was a test of his authority that had to be met with overwhelming force. They tell a story of how a minor land dispute that could have been settled with a handshake and a jug of whiskey was instead escalated by French into a public standoff, simply because the other party was a distant cousin of the Eversoles. He wasn't just defending his land, he was defending his name, and he was willing to risk blood over it. This was the crack in each man's armor. Joe Eversole's ambition made him believe he was smarter than the old code, that he could push and prod and modernize without consequence. He saw Ben French not as a man to be respected, but as a stubborn relic to be swept aside by the march of progress. And Big Ben French's pride made it impossible for him to ignore a single one of those prods. He saw every move Joe Eversole made not as a political calculation, but as a direct, personal insult to his family and his way of life. One man could not stop pushing, and the other could not bend. Their flaws were perfectly matched, a lit fuse reaching for a barrel of gunpowder. It was no longer a question of if the county would explode, but when. The final break, the moment the bad blood turned to poison, didn't happen in a courtroom or a political debate. The legend says it happened where so many mountain feuds begin, over a bottle of whiskey and a game of cards. In 1886, in a smoke-filled room in Hazard, Joe Eversole and Ben French sat across from each other. The air was already thick with tension, but the liquor loosened their tongues and sharpened their contempt. A dispute over the game, a simple accusation of cheating or a misplayed hand, quickly spiraled. It was no longer about cards. It was about everything. Joe Eversole, with his lawyer's wit, made a sharp, condescending remark about the old ways, a jab at the French clan's stubborn resistance to progress. It was a flick of the wrist, but it landed like a fist on Big Ben French's jaw. For a man like French, whose entire world was built on the rock of his personal authority and the honor of his name, this public insult from a man he saw as an upstart was intolerable. His pride, that massive, unbending thing, ignited. He rose from his chair, his shadow swallowing Eversole, and the threats he made were not vague. They were promises, spoken low and cold, of what happens to men who forget their place. In the mountains, a public threat is a debt that must be paid. To let it pass is to admit you are the weaker man, and weakness is a death sentence. The line had been crossed. The room fell silent as the two men stared each other down, and everyone present knew they had just witnessed the conception of a war. Joe Eversole had poked the bear, believing his intelligence was shield enough. Ben French had been challenged in his own kingdom, and his pride demanded a brutal, unforgettable lesson. The lesson came a short time later, not in the open but from the shadows. Nicholas "Nick" Combs was Joe Eversole's uncle, a trusted friend and a respected man in his own right. He was ambushed on a quiet mountain road, shot from his saddle without a chance to draw his own weapon. It was a cold, calculated act of terror. There was no trial, no witnesses came forward, but everyone in Perry County knew. This was the French clan's answer. It was a message written in blood, sent directly to Joe Eversole. For Joe, this was the moment the chessboard was kicked over. The murder of his uncle was not a political move. It was an act of savagery that ripped through his modern worldview. The old code he had tried to outsmart had just reached out and torn a hole in his family. His grief was matched only by a cold, burning rage. There would be no more debates, no more legal maneuvering. Ben French had chosen the language of the gun. Now, Joe Eversole would answer in kind. The affront had been delivered, and the only acceptable response was vengeance. The blood of Nick Combs was a seed, and from it a forest of rifles began to grow. Joe Eversole's grief was a cold, sharp thing, and it pointed him down a path from which there was no turning back. Now, you might think the mountain code would demand a simple, brutal balance, a life for a life. A French loyalist, maybe the man who pulled the trigger, would be found dead in a creek bed, and the scales of honor would be level once more. That was the old way. That was the path of compromise. Elders from both clans, men with grey in their beards who had seen enough killing in their time, tried to steer the currents back to that old channel. They came to Joe Eversole, not as enemies, but as neighbors. They spoke of the cost of a wider war, of fields that would go unplowed and children who would grow up without fathers. They pleaded with him to seek a targeted revenge, to let the matter end there before it consumed them all. They warned him that turning Perry County into a battlefield would only serve the interests of the outside coal men who were watching from the hills like vultures. But Joe Eversole was deaf to their warnings. His calculating mind, now fueled by rage, saw this as a moment of opportunity. A simple revenge killing would just continue the endless cycle. He wanted to end it permanently. He didn't want to just balance the scales, he wanted to smash them. He rejected the pleas for peace, framing his decision not as vengeance, but as a crusade. He would raise an army, march on Hazard, and tear the corrupt French regime out by its roots. He would bring, he claimed, a new kind of law to the mountains. It was the perfect justification, wrapping his raw ambition and his thirst for retribution in the noble flag of progress. Across the county, Ben French watched Eversole's mobilization, and his own pride provided the equal and opposite reaction. He heard the same pleas for peace, the same warnings, and he threw them back in the faces of those who offered them. To him, backing down now, offering a sacrifice to appease Eversole, would be an admission of guilt and a show of weakness he could not abide. He saw Eversole gathering men and buying rifles, and it confirmed his deepest suspicions. This was never about an uncle's death. It was a coup. So French began to prepare for a siege. He was the high sheriff, and he would turn the county seat into his personal fortress. He gathered his own loyalists, men who saw Eversole's progress as a threat to their very existence. He sent riders out, and the French clan answered the call. They barricaded windows in the courthouse and reinforced the doors of their homes. Each nail hammered into a board was another nail in the coffin of peace. Each new Winchester rifle that arrived in Hazard was another vote for war. The path of compromise was now completely overgrown, and the two factions were marching down separate parallel roads, destined to collide in the streets of the town they both claimed to be fighting for. On the night before the battle, a heavy silence fell over the hills around Hazard. It was a cold, clear November in 1887, and under a sky full of hard, distant stars, two armies lay waiting for the dawn. On the ridges outside of town, Joe Eversole's men huddled around small, smokeless fires, their Winchester rifles oiled and ready. Inside the town, Ben French's followers stood watch at the darkened windows of the courthouse, their own weapons loaded. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing what the morning light would bring. Into this tense stillness, a single figure walked the lonely road between the two camps. It was an old circuit preacher, a man who belonged to no clan but God's. He had christened babies from both families and spoken the final words over their dead. He represented the last flickering candle flame of peace in a room reeking of gunpowder. He went first to Joe Eversole's camp. He found him staring into the darkness toward Hazard and made his plea, his voice low and urgent. He spoke not of politics, but of souls. He named the men on both sides who would be dead by the next sundown, men whose children he knew by name. "Is this the future you want to build, Joe?" he asked. "A county of widows and orphans?" For a moment, they say, Joe Eversole hesitated. He looked at the faces of his own men, young and old, farmers and loggers who had put their faith in him. He saw the terrible cost of his ambition laid bare. This was his final crossroads. He could call it off, accept the stalemate, and live with his uncle's death unavenged. But then he thought of Nick Combs lying dead on that lonely road, of Ben French's public insult, of the future he had promised his people. His fatal flaw, that cold, calculating logic, took over. To back down now would be to lose everything. He turned to the preacher and said, "Reverend, this isn't war. This is an extermination. The sickness is in that courthouse, and I am the cure." The old preacher then walked into the besieged town of Hazard, past French's armed sentries, and found Big Ben in the darkened sheriff's office. He made a different plea, an appeal to French's duty and his pride. "Ben," he said, "you are the sheriff. You are the law. Don't let your own town become a slaughterhouse. Show them you are the bigger man. Offer a truce." Ben French stood, a giant silhouette against the window, and looked out at the campfires of the Eversole army flickering on his hills like a disease. He too stood at a crossroads. He could offer a concession, perhaps hand over the man suspected of killing Nick Combs and spare the town. But his pride, that unbending mountain of a thing, would not allow it. To him, a truce was surrender. It was an admission that Joe Eversole had the right to march an army to his doorstep. He turned from the window, his face set like stone. "They are the ones who came for a war, Reverend," he said. "My only duty now is to see that they get one. You go and pray for their souls. I'll take care of their bodies." With those words, the final door to peace was slammed shut and bolted. The last chance was gone, burned away by the pride of two men who had chosen the path of no compromise. The dawn came up grey and cold over Hazard, and with the first weak light came the sound that would define Perry County for years to come. It wasn't a single shot, but a volley, a deafening, ripping roar as 100 Winchester rifles opened fire from the hills. The Battle of Hazard had begun. For the people of the town, cowering in their homes, it was as if the sky itself was being torn apart. The sound was everywhere, a physical force that rattled windows and shook the very floorboards. The morning birds fell silent, replaced by the high-pitched whine of ricochets and the sharp, splintering crack of bullets chewing through wooden walls. From the ridge, Joe Eversole watched his plan unfold. The world narrowed to the objective, the county courthouse, now a stone fortress spitting fire. His men moved like shadows, darting from the cover of one house to the next, their rifles barking in short, angry bursts. But for every man who moved, a dozen puffs of smoke would erupt from the courthouse and the surrounding buildings. The air grew thick and acrid with the smell of burnt black powder. This wasn't the swift, surgical strike he had envisioned. This was a meat grinder. The logic and planning that had brought him here felt useless against the sheer, stubborn reality of stone walls and determined men. Inside that courthouse, Big Ben French was no longer a sheriff. He was a general in a siege. The cavernous rooms echoed with the thunder of his own men's rifles. The air was a haze of smoke, and the constant thud of Eversole's bullets against the thick stone walls was a drumbeat of impending doom. He would move from window to window, his massive frame a silhouette against the flashes of gunfire, directing his kin with a quiet word or a nod. His world was reduced to what he could see through those narrow, deadly rectangles of glass, the street below, where men he had known his whole life were now trying to end his. He felt the weight of his unbending pride, not as a burden, but as the foundation holding the building up. For the families of Hazard, the war was a terrifying, unseen monster living on the floor above them. Huddled in their root cellars, they could only listen. They heard the frantic running of booted feet on the boardwalks, the desperate shouted commands, and the ceaseless, terrifying percussion of the rifles. A woman clutched her children as the jars of canned beans on the shelf rattled from the concussions overhead. An old man pressed his ear to the dirt floor, trying to discern the sounds of friend from foe. The battle wasn't just in the streets, it was in their homes, a violation so profound it would leave a scar on their memory forever. For 2 full days, the town was a war zone. The fighting would lull, creating a tense, ringing silence where the only sound was a dog barking in the distance, and then it would erupt again in a furious crescendo of violence. A man who rose from behind a stone wall to take a shot might suddenly disappear from view. A figure running across an open street would stumble and lie still. The argument that had begun over a card table was now being settled with lead, and its costs were written in the still forms that dotted the muddy streets. Finally, as the second day bled into a weary dusk, the firing from the hills began to slacken. Joe Eversole had to accept the truth. The courthouse would not fall. His army, battered and low on ammunition, began to melt back into the mountains from which it had come. The retreat was slow, sullen, and bitter. A great, profound silence descended upon Hazard, a silence that felt heavier and more menacing than the noise it replaced. The smoke slowly cleared, revealing a town that looked like it had been savaged by a great beast. Windows were shattered, doors were splintered, and the courthouse stood defiant, pockmarked but unbroken. The Battle of Hazard was over, but the war had just begun. No ground had been gained, no decisive victory won. But a terrible line had been crossed. The men of Perry County had proven they were willing to turn their own home into a battlefield. They had fired on their neighbors, their cousins, their kin. The courthouse still belonged to Ben French, but the town and the soul of the county now belonged to the feud. As the last shots faded, Joe Eversole's grand army was gone. It had dissolved, melting back into the hollows like a dirty spring snow. The retreat was a grim, silent affair. There was no order given, just a shared, unspoken understanding that the battle was lost. Men carried their wounded on makeshift litters, their faces grim with exhaustion and defeat. Joe Eversole rode with them, his visionary's fire banked to a cold, hard ember of humiliation. He had promised his people a swift victory, a new order. Instead, he had led them into a bloody stalemate and left his dead in the streets of Hazard. In the cold twilight of the mountains, he could feel the weight of his failure and the burning need for a different kind of war. The road of the open soldier had ended. The path of the assassin was just beginning. Back in Hazard, Ben French walked out of the pockmarked courthouse into the ruins of his town. He was the victor, but there was no triumph in his eyes. He stood on the steps and surveyed the damage. The sour smell of gunpowder and fresh splintered pine hung heavy in the air. A dead horse lay in the street, and further down, a shape under a blanket told a story he didn't need to hear. Doors creaked open, and the faces of the townspeople peered out, their eyes full of a new kind of fear. They weren't looking at a sheriff who had saved them, but at a warlord who had made their home a battlefield. He walked the muddy streets, his boots crunching on shattered glass. He saw the bullet holes that stitched across the front of the general store, the gouges in the church steeple. He had held his ground. He had beaten back the usurper. His pride was intact. But the cost was written on every building, on every frightened face. This victory tasted like ash and gunpowder. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was not the end. Joe Eversole would not simply accept this defeat. The war would not be fought with armies anymore. It would be fought in the dark, on lonely roads, with a single shot from a hidden rifle. He had won the battle, but in doing so, he had sentenced his county and himself to a long, slow bleed. The road hadn't ended. It had just become a darker and more treacherous path for everyone. The silence that followed the Battle of Hazard wasn't peace. It was the sound of a held breath. The Eversole army had retreated, but the war had spread, seeping like a fever into every cabin and hollow in Perry County. Before the battle, you could be a man who was friendly with both sides. After, there was no middle ground. The fighting had drawn a line of blood and gunpowder through the heart of the community, and every single person was now